I'd like to now invite for a roundtable discussion. We'll have time for questions and comments after we hear the roundtable. So please, Professor Eitan Friedman, Professor Vardit, Ravitsky, please join us. I'll introduce you. Sivan, please return. I think it's wonderful the way that Sivan has really opened up this this question, not only overregulation and underregulation, but other questions of flexibility and also being mindful of advancements in sciences, and the question of equity, which I think is a question of inclusion, but not only of inclusion, and we'll be talking about this later today and perhaps also in this roundtable about other forms of social responsibility in this context. But let me first introduce to you our other two speakers on the panel, Professor Eitan Friedman. You can see the full biographies in the booklet that's available, but let me just give the brief introduction. So Professor Eitan Friedman is a medical physician and a professor MD PhD at Tel Aviv University. In the context of the present conversation, very important to note, he is the head of the Helsinki Committee in the Israeli Ministry of Health, which is the high bioethical IRB committee, which is in many ways the final instance of these questions, and also specifically responsible for regulating genetic research and other specific research areas. And our other speaker, I'm very happy and pleased to have with us this morning, also Professor Vardit Ravitsky, who's a professor of bioethics at the program at the Department of Social and Preventive Medicine at the School of Public Health at the University of Montreal, Canada, and a senior lecturer on global health and social medicine at Harvard Medical School. So it would be wonderful to hear your thoughts on these questions. Professor Eitan Friedman and then Professor Ravitsky, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chai. Thank you, Sivan, for the wonderful overview, and thank you guys sitting here and watching us for allowing us to express our opinions on this very important topic. First off, a few comments about the presentation. I couldn't help but notice that most of the articles that you presented on hyperregulation or overregulations are from 2004 to 2008. And that begs the question, what has happened since? I mean, has this been proven to be true? Has the level of regulation been increased ever since? Has the level of research been decreased? Has less application been approved? Is science less robust? I don't know about that. I mean, I'm just asking the question. You want to answer that, or we'll wait until the end?
We'll wait.
We'll wait. Just one comment about the reality in Israel. The fast track in Israel is on paper only. There is no fast track committee, and I've been the head of the committee for almost 3 years, and this is one of on the to-do list. We need a fast track, especially in times of pandemic, especially with big data analysis, especially with issues of existing data and issues that would not concern the anonymity, the privacy, or anything that is harmful for the patients. And the other comment about the reality in Israel, although there is no official appeal mechanism for anybody who submits his research proposal for ethical approval, the committee, under my guidance over the last 3 years, we've reviewed close to 300 proposals, and none has been rejected outright. Only 2 have not been approved for, I think, just reasons. And every time we reject it, we say you can resubmit given these considerations, and sometimes it comes back to us, or it goes back to the local IRB, to the lower level IRB. So although there is no official appeal mechanism, the ability to correct the request for ethical approval is there, and it's been used times and again. I think, from my perspective, If I may just say about over and under regulation, there is no way to satisfy everyone, like you said. Those who want to pursue science, those who are enthusiastic, and those who want to preserve the public's ability to control their own destiny, that midline would never be met. However, I think there's sufficient amount of knowledge, sufficient amount of data that has been collected over the years, and sufficient amount of heads that are involved in looking at the research to try and harmonize everything, both at the national level and at the international level. So, for example, my view should be that the Healthy Committee or the Ethics Committee should draw the guidelines not only from national level, but from an umbrella of guidelines that would be broadly defined by either the WHO or the I don't know, some sort of an international body that would give leeway and a framework for approving genetics research and different paths for data analysis, for triage, for fast track, for research under pandemic, research under stress, for the general public's research that could improve the public health at times of crisis. And in each country, they should be streamlined and harmonized, and does not need to be one level, two levels, too many bureaucracies, too many obstacles, and that should be streamlined. And as I told you before we met, before this lecture, on my to-do list or on my bucket list is to try and harmonize things, at least here in Israel. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Friedman. Professor Ravitsky.
I have slides.
Wonderful.
That's okay.
We'll see it over there.
Thank you, Shai. Thank you to the Academy for this wonderful meeting. I grew up in Jerusalem, so for me this is a homecoming. And it's very, very exciting to host. I feel like I'm hosting colleagues from all over the world because it's my city. It's also a rare opportunity for my brother to come hear me, which he cannot do in Canada. In typical Israeli style, Sivan, Dr. Tamir, I would like to try and push back a little bit, and I hope this will stimulate discussion. So in your conclusion to this wonderful report that you presented to us, you say that regulation is in the eye of the beholder, and that typically patients and bioethicists want more of it, and researchers and funders want less of it. And this is the point I would like to put a question mark on, and I'll use the Canadian and US perspective, the environments in which I work daily. Before I do that specifically, I want to step back and look at bioethics at a very, very high level. We have some leading voices in the field sitting here, and it's an opportunity to note something that has been bothering me for many years, and that is that bioethics is often perceived as focused on concerns, on the risks of emerging biotechnologies, and overall on why not to proceed, why we should slow down, why we should be cautious, why sometimes we should not do things. And Dr. Grady will talk tomorrow morning about science that perhaps we should not pursue at all. Why is that? Obviously, and Dr. Tamir noted that, because bioethics is historically associated with protectionist and precautionary approaches. We have to remember the history of research ethics and how it was born in order to protect individuals from institutional forces. And because obviously researchers often meet ethics at the approval point through IRBs. And I often, just like you, Sivan, hear researchers talk about the ethics police, the administrative burden. But this focus is, to me, misguided and sad, because bioethics is obviously also about the why. Yes, we do the work we do to promote potential benefits because of the fundamental hope of health and well-being for everybody through justice and equity. And we have to stay focused on the opportunity cost of not exploring a promising field. We in Canada have been working with Professor Knoppers on how to operationalize this right that many countries have ratified decades ago in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the right to benefit from the advancement of science and its applications. And it has been sort of a dormant right. It hasn't been relied upon by governments and institutions to promote the kind of approach that I'm speaking about. So to me, a bioethical view of emerging biotechnologies is obviously about an intricate balance, and that's actually what you said in your conclusions, an intricate balance of risk and potential benefit. But my emphasis today is that proposed limitations on progress or innovation need robust justification. Robust. We can't just have a gut feeling that this might raise concern, maybe for certain populations. So with that high-level call for focus on the why yes, I want to go back to these two claims that are made in the report, that patients and bioethicists want more regulation and researchers and funders want less. So let me start with, do patients really want more regulation? And I'm giving the example of this Canadian organization, Mito Canada, established by parents of children who suffer from mitochondrial diseases that are devastating, incurable, and they work to fund research themselves. And this is a growing phenomenon of patient advocacy groups who actually collect money to fund research directly, which means that they get to choose the research projects that they will promote. And they work with us, the bioethicists, to remove regulatory burden that actually bans this kind of research in Canada. They work with us to write policy proposals. And this is just one example of dozens of such patient groups seeing regulation as overly burdensome. So I would claim that in many cases, patients want less. My overall claim will be that they want better. Do bioethicists want more regulation? This is a team that I work with. Professor Kimmelman is here from Canada, and he recognizes all these people. We have been working for years to change the law in Canada to allow research in the lab, not babies born, but research in the lab that involves genetic modification. This would be actually banned for mitochondrial disease, what I just mentioned, but it actually means that Canada is slow down in one of the most promising fields of research. We're losing Canadian brains to other countries, and Canadian patients are saying you're not setting the stage for what we will need in years to come. And the case study of germline gene editing, as Dr. Tamir analyzed in her comparative analysis, is obviously a case in point, because the perceived magnitude of the potential benefits and risks here is, through the roof, and therefore many countries have banned not just reproductive use, but even the research, in Canada is one of them. Here is the federal criminal law in Canada that says no person shall knowingly alter the genome of an in vitro embryo such that the alteration is capable of being transmitted to descendants. And our group says, wait, what does capable mean? If I do this in the lab, technically it's capable, but if we never implant this modified embryo and there's no baby, then it is not capable of being transmitted because there will be no descendants. And we called upon the government to clarify this point, and they said, no, we take the prohibitive approach, no lab research, even though there is a possible interpretation here that capable would allow research. That's not me. And look at the punishment. It's up to a fine of $500,000 or up to 10 years in prison. And of course, what scientist would take the risk of doing that, even when the pressure comes from the patient themselves? So we, for years, convened workshops, and we wrote papers in leading bioethics journals. And here's one that I'm inviting you to read. It's very short, in Nature Regenerative Medicine, actually calling the government to revisit Canadian policy to allow this research. So, and we worked with the media. We tried to send out this message through main media sources. Here's a piece on our work in the National Post. And this is a funny story. I was giving a talk about this to a room full of hundreds of researchers who are actually wanting to do this work and feel limited. And I jokingly said something, and I said, if there's journalists in the room, please don't quote me. And of course, the next day, it was quoted. And they said, Ravitsky jokingly suggested that someone in the audience who could afford to pay $500,000 or happy to sit in prison for a few years would just start doing this research and then challenge the legislation in courts if prosecuted. And this touches a Canadian nerve, because I don't know if you know, but abortion was a criminal in Canada for many years. And the way that law changed was a doctor who conducted pregnancy termination provocatively in a visible way, ended up in prison as a criminal and challenged the law, ended up changing the law, now termination in Canada as decriminalized, and ended up years later becoming a Canadian hero, getting the highest award, like the Israeli prize here, the Order of Canada. So Canada has a history of changing the law through the provocative acts of actors on the ground. So I would claim that patients and bioethicists do not want more regulation. They want better regulation, and Dr. Tamir started pointing in the direction of what that would look like. Lastly, do researchers and funders actually want less regulations? I don't think so. From the case of Jesse Gelsinger, who tragically died in a gene therapy trial 20 years ago, when we have Professor Moreno here from the university where that happened, all the way to the very recent Chinese genetically edited twins scandal, Dr. He Jiankui, we know that researchers need appropriate regulation, otherwise we lose public trust in science. The outcome of the Gelsinger death was an almost complete pause on gene therapy trials for many years, which was a great shame, a terrible opportunity cost for patients. And we are still living in the aftermath of the Chinese scandal and what that would do to gene editing trials going forward. So we need public trust to advance research. We need public support, and my overall claim today is that bioethics facilitates science by ensuring we move forward responsibly. It does not hinder it. And my conclusions, now surprisingly, Dr. Tamir, after pretending to criticize what you said, I'm actually totally in line with you. I think we need to pay attention to the dangers of slippery slope-based regulation. Just because something might have unacceptable uses later on, we shouldn't ban acceptable uses now. You pointed to the benefits of flexible governance that allows innovation based on scientific progress, such as lifting barriers when techniques become safe and socially acceptable. So soft governance, moratoria is better than laws, and if you must have a law, at least build in mechanisms that require revisions regularly. I don't think we should focus solely on precautionary principles, but also on the opportunity cost, as I said, and we have to recognize as a foundational concept the right to benefit from science and its applications. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Vardit Ravitsky. I'll allow for Sivan Tamir to respond briefly, then I'll have a question or two to the panelists, and we'll open up. We have ample time to have all these discussions and conversations. Sivan.
So thank you, Professor Friedman and Professor Varditsky, for valuable comments. I'll start with you. Well, actually, I looked fervently for writing on overregulation and underregulation, and all that I could find, perhaps I didn't look very well, but I did look over a period of time, were those articles which I've mentioned and also cited in my review. So I can either assume that researchers became exasperated with the whole thing, or
nothing has changed.
Perhaps they felt their voice is not being heard, or that nothing has changed. But I really don't have a better answer for that. As for the appeal mechanisms, I did not mean exclusively for appeal mechanisms for rejected applications, but rather also for opinions given by IRBs or RECs, which have requirements which researchers and sponsors feel that they could not meet, and they would like to contest those requirements. So sort of, so for this we don't have, well, in Israel we don't have an appropriate mechanism. As for what Professor Ravitsky said, I like the why yes argument, and of course I agreed with everything that you said about limitations, needing robust justifications. This is something which, of course, I subscribe to, but I feel that when we talk about less regulation or more regulation is just not just the proportionality of it, but rather something which is more nuanced, whether this regulation is in fact burdensome at the end of the day for researchers, and even if patients want less regulation, I suppose they mean regulation that will allow research to be conducted, but not such that will waive the proper protection of the rights and interests. So in this respect, I feel there is a small nuance there. And I agree with what you said about soft governance, and because I believe, especially in fields such as biomedical research, which is constantly evolving and requiring great flexibility, then soft law, I think, is always better than hard law. Of course, you need to have some structure there, but in the middle, you have to have those opportunities for flexibility and adaptability to changing trends in scientific research, and also in available data pools and such. That's it for me.
Thank you, Sivan. I have two questions for the panelists, and then we'll open it up for further questions from the audience. So one question that comes out from the review that Sivan offered us is the differences across countries in the regulation of bioethics. And one of the points that Eitan made was that actually is counterproductive, and that what we really need is an internationalization through the World Health Organization or other ways to create actually standardized bioethical regulation. And my question is, where do the panelists stand on this question, and to try and steer a conversation around this, because there are good reasons, I think, to actually have localized ethical regulations, because these are deeply controversial questions, and if we want a democratic process, and if we want an inclusive process, and we want a process that will produce trust and legitimacy from the general public, it needs to reflect the different positions within the public on these. So the fact that Germany, this is an extreme example, has very restrictive regulations, and that according at least to the myth, but Sivan has actually complicated things, Israel has a very permissive regulation of due to the value of reproductive reproductive and the value of family in Israeli society and the wish to reproduce, perhaps a more lenient, or at least that's how the argument works, makes sense in a cultural context and historical context. Obviously, religion also has a lot to do with this. So science we think of as a universal project, but ethics often differs from culture to culture. So how do you think this kind of tension should be mediated? And I think, Vardit, your example from Canada and the specific history of Canadian legislation also plays into this. So it would be helpful, I think, to hear a little bit more.
You want to start? I'll go. To me, it's fairly simple, but things are simple to me always. I think it's not meant to be a country-specific regulation. It's meant to be like an umbrella, like a skeleton, and this should be the bare minimum, and it should be phrased in the broader way that each country puts its own stamp, its own brand, its own scent, if you will, driven by society, driven by religion, way of life, beliefs, geographical location, and what have you. So there should not be any difference in terms of approval process in each country. There should not be any difference in the way each society sees big data analysis. There should be no difference in terms of the patient's trust of how to obtain an informed consent for future genetic testing in biobanks. These are okay. These are fine. Where the differences are, and that should be influenced by each country, is how to deal with genetic gene transfer or gene therapy. This I don't think in the current day and age and in the current climate in the world can be resolved in a harmonized manner. But let's do what we can to harmonize what we can harmonize and what we all agree. And the other issue, it should not be written in stone. It should be flexible. We should be attentive to the development of science. We should be attuned to the public's needs and wants. We should be attuned to what the pharma companies want, not bend over for them, but should be attuned to them and regather and regroup and rewrite these guidelines every so often, not once every 10 years, but maybe once every 3 years.
So I think everything's complicated, and yet I agree with you, which is very surprising.
Simple.
So I think everybody wants harmonization. There are two risks that we haven't mentioned yet of research tourism or medical tourism that emerges from these differences. So it's not by chance that the first baby ever born following mitochondrial replacement therapy was born in Mexico to a Jordanian couple treated by an American team. The ultimate example of what happens when we perceive each country to have different regulations and we tend to go to the less restrictive places to do novel things. But that goes back to justice and equity, because that means that only rich people can afford such international journeys, and that some countries are left behind in terms of what they can offer their citizens within the healthcare system. So the lack of harmonization is dangerous for patients. It's not good for science in many cases. But culture is strong, and we will never have that across the board.
But I want to challenge you on that. The whole idea of tourism is an argument that's made in very many contexts, but we don't seem to take it as seriously when it comes to organ markets, for example. One could make a similar argument, and still we don't think that the fact that things are lenient in some countries should influence the level of restriction posed in other countries. We don't think the same thing about euthanasia or about surrogacy. So it's true, I mean, in theory, that people who can afford it can go somewhere else to get the services that they want, but we don't take that as a serious consideration when we think about how to regulate in our own countries. So why would we take that argument seriously when it comes to the regulation of bioethical research?
I think that you're taking the conversation in the philosophical direction of relativism and universalism in a way, because if there are certain ethical principles that should guide anything, practice or research, and I'm looking at Professor Haid, who might help us during the discussion with a philosophical insight on this, then obviously we should not allow influences of less restrictive regions in the world to influence what should occur. So if we have a universalist ethical basis for harmonization, we should follow that.
Right, so it's a principled argument. It's not, because you raised the pragmatic aspect, right? That came from you said, if we don't have a harmonized world, people will go elsewhere. And
so I think the bottom line, and why I agree with you, is that I think we have two types of issues here. We call it the skeleton. I call it the framework, the high level. Look what happened with cloning, right? Most countries right away banned because there was international agreement that we should not go there. So on things where there is international consensus, we managed to harmonize, even though the efforts were local. And then there are things that are more nuanced, more detailed, and more dependent on cultural values, maybe religious values, where we will never be able to reach this level of agreement. So I think where we have universal agreement, where we have bioethical principles that, okay, who's the we, right? Goes back to the philosophical question of relativism. If there are philosophical bioethical principles that we want to impose across the board, let's strive for harmonization and acknowledge that in certain areas it will never be possible.
Thanks.
I also come from the school of complicated, so being Polish. I agree with what Vardit just said. I think that while we should aspire for perhaps universalism that will advance scientific progress, which will benefit all of us, I think that we cannot relinquish or waive or consider that the culture-specific, jurisdiction-specific interests will come into play. I think that one example is that of data research or health data research, and a prominent data ethics principle is one which data subjects should be benefited by the research conducted using their data. So then we go back to, if we consider it from a universalist approach, then perhaps people from different countries with different healthcare systems should equally benefit or not benefit from the data used for the research. So this is a problem because in Israel, and I think in Canada as well, and in the UK and Australia, where you have universal healthcare systems and where the health system is publicly funded through taxes, then you have data which also in some sense belongs to the citizens themselves, the medically insured individuals, and they should benefit from it. And if you take data from Israel and data from the US, well, such health system is not in place, then which principle would you abide by? I mean, would you consider this a more like a more privately funded healthcare system, which perhaps needs to benefit patients on a more I forgot the right word for this, or would you perhaps consider it according to what is done or what is expected in a universal healthcare system in terms of giving back benefits to individuals?
I can answer some of that. I don't think we should dive into or dissect or try to decipher what is good for a socialized medicine, healthcare system across the board, private medicine, a combination thereof, or any other nuances that may exist. We should provide the guidelines. We should provide the framework. And the benefit of the patient, the benefit to the patients may not be immediate. It may be to its descendants. It may be to healthcare policy, which would indirectly affect them. So it does not need to be an immediate gain by that particular individual in this context of research. It can be a benefit for the future of that patient. It can be a benefit for better early detection of ovarian cancer. It can be a benefit for better guidelines or better allocation of government funds to allow a more appropriate, personally addressed cancer care or lowering sudden death in individuals who engage in extreme sports. It does not need to be an immediate benefit for that particular patient. It can be more broad-based, and that can be addressed regardless of the exact healthcare system. One other issue that I wanted to address is I don't only want to harmonize the guidelines for acceptance. I also want to harmonize the path. So it should be the same path. It's if you registered in one country and you're approved, the path should be one IRB, one approval, and that's it. You don't need a 2-tier, a 3-tier, a 4-tier approach. It needs to be 1-tier approach, and it should be broad-based. And I also have some reflections and suggestions on the composition and the workflow of each ethics committee, but that may not be the forum to express that.
Well, we'll see if the discussion goes there. But so I want to take us forward, but just to say that the question of harmonization across countries, you suggest, a few of you suggested that there's like a base that can be agreed on, and then there's variations, or that there is a process that can be agreed upon, and then there's content that could differ. Mm-hmm. But I think that a counter argument would be that the process is substantive. It's not just a question of procedure and bureaucracy. If we regulate genetics in Israel and other countries at two-tier level, it's not just a bureaucratic hurdle. It's value laden in the sense that the system expresses a concern with genetics and with genetic exceptionalism and with germline gene editing. So I think there's no simple answer to this, and you can't always sort of set apart the procedure from the substantive regulation. And I think that Sivan, in a way, showed that in the different ways in which these questions are regulated procedurally. But let's take the conversation forward, and I'm happy that Sivan took us beyond the classic question of genetics and genetic editing and introduced other questions, for example, questions of big data and privacy. And there you can also see privacy in a different way than genetics, but it also differs highly across cultures, and it's not something that we could all agree upon necessarily. But this, I think, and so now the segue to the next question concerns what's new. So a lot of the discussion that we heard today would be true also 20 and 30 years ago. We're facing some of the same questions, and what I like to raise is whether there's anything new, and this follows also on Professor Brandt's presentation from yesterday, trying to understand whether there are new challenges facing bioethical regulation. We didn't hear this morning yet about the pandemic and how that really shifts our understanding of biomedical research and bioethical regulation. We'll hear later today, but perhaps you'd like to comment on this already at this point, of big data and the importance of big data or AI or other technological developments. But it's not only about the developments in technology, it's also a growing awareness perhaps in societies of concerns, for example, of concerns of equity and sort of disparity across countries, and the question of who benefits from the advancements of modern science. So I wonder whether you could comment on this and sort of reflect a little bit about what's new in the past 10, 5, 3 years. Go ahead.
I think from a bioethical perspective, one of the more recent concepts that is emerging in research ethics is the concept of solidarity, and the notion that maybe in some cases we need to move away from protectionist approaches all the way to claiming that certain individuals or certain populations have a duty to participate in research. It's not very novel. Some of my colleagues have been writing about this for a while. But when we look at the history of research ethics and how focused we have been on protecting individuals and communities, this is overall a novel concept. And I'll give 3 examples. The obvious one is the rare disease community. If you have 10 patients in the world suffering from a disease, and half of them refuse to participate or choose not to participate, this really hinders your efforts to understand the etiology of the disease and to find a cure. So in certain circumstances, individuals are under pressure to participate for the common good. How do we protect them? Is it okay to convince them? Is it okay to put pressure on them for the sake of others? These are newer questions that bioethicists are thinking about. In the context of, I actually came here directly from another meeting that blew my mind, where we tried to come up with a research ethics framework for research in space done on astronauts in private space flight. So if you're a NASA-funded astronaut, NASA can demand that you participate in research. Actually, they can. They're not supposed to force you or even push you. I learned that. But what if you pay $25 million to go to space for 3 days and you're told, oh, we also want to draw blood and bone marrow because we can learn a lot from your time in space. So the private context, again, these are, at first it'll be only dozens or hundreds of people from whom we can learn valuable things for health on Earth. Can we pressure these people to participate? So it's a very different context than the rare disease community, but another interesting example of research can only be done on specific groups or individuals. Is it okay? Is it ethically acceptable to demand participation. In the context of COVID, the issue was, if we want to speed up the development of vaccines and drugs, can we study big data without consent? Identifiable, not identifiable, but colleagues have been writing about this during the pandemic, and actually restrictions were removed in an emergency context to speed up development. And it was seen as ethically absolutely acceptable because of the circumstances. So I think that if you ask what's new, and I'd love to hear my colleagues on this, I think removing enough from protection, the original historically based protectionist approaches, to ask novel questions about our responsibility and even obligation to contribute to research, again, as individuals and as groups. And this, if it becomes a socially acceptable new discourse, will influence significantly how we approve not just studies, but approaches to research.
The two new things that come to my mind is the ability to generate a lot of genetic data in one go, whole exome sequencing, whole genome sequencing, and the analysis that comes out of it. And what do you do with the data? How do you curate it? How do you store it? How do you prevent stealing the data? How do you prevent someone from abusing it for a variety of reasons? And the second issue on the same, a sub-issue is it your duty to report, to disclose to the individual who participated in the study what is known as secondary or incidental findings? So if a study is done, whole genome sequencing of 100,000 people with hypertension, and you find in, let's say, 1,000 of the 500 or 1,000 of them mutations in cancer susceptibility gene, I think, ethically speaking, it should be on the sponsor to disclose this information in the context of freely available, timely genetic counseling, and I'm trying to push that into practice in Israel, at least not without a lot of confrontation. This is one issue. The other issue is what's new is the ability to build huge database and store them in the cloud, and the prevention of leakage of information or invasion of the information and drawing out is an issue that was never faced 10 or 15 years ago, and the ability to protect it is an issue that needs to be contended in every ethics committee around the globe. And it should be, and I think, a part of parcel of the changes in the structure of the committee, there needs to be a permanent person who's responsible for being updated in the best ways or the optimal ways to conserve the data and prevent, harm-seeking individuals of taking advantage of this genetic information.
Well, what's new? I think that the first thing, I agree with you, Vardit, is the issue of participatory patienthood, where we have patients participating in, well, as research becomes less interventional, less burdensome, there is an expectation of human subjects, data subjects to incline to participate in research which benefits society as a whole or certain groups in society. So this is one thing that perhaps yes, it's expectation for participation and the interest, the self-interest of those groups to participate themselves. And the second thing is about expertise, competencies and literacy, or rather the lack of, as research becomes more or as technology oriented, as we have more AI-based technologies, research before being implemented into healthcare, and using large data sets for health data research, we realize that we need more competencies, more nuanced competencies within the very professionals which review and approve those trials or studies. And also greater literacy is required from from researchers and from healthcare professionals, that's another question. And perhaps some basic digital and genetic literacy for patients as well. I mean, for patients participating in research, particularly in the context of variants of unknown significance, whereby they need to understand if they're required to opt out of being disclosed such incidental findings, and they need to understand the implications of opting out or rather opting in. So that requires also basic genetic literacy for patients as well.
One other issue, and it goes back to the question of how long the consent forms are. Some consent, you know, in Israel, the law says it's only 15 pages. I've read, you know, especially by the pharma, 32, 43 with a lot of technical words. And I think the guideline should be, keep it simple. The person who reads informed consent needs to know what he's getting into. He doesn't know the exact words. And I think literacy in that respect means that the consent form can be done digitally and with the help of an animation that would ease things up and speed things up and make it clear to the person who signs his name.
So I just want to reflect on what we've just heard and then open it up for further questions from the audience. I think that following Vardit and some of the other comments, we may be facing, or that's the question at least, really a shift in the framework of understanding bioethics and bioethical regulation. And the shift could be phrased as one moving from individual rights and the basis on informed consent as an example of this, to responsibilities and duties and the need for broader participation of patients and of us, the public, in biomedical research. I think, though, that I would add to what Vardit has suggested, that it's not a one-way road. That is, Vardit emphasized the fact that this may lead to relaxing some of the regulations on protecting individual rights and only doing so, limiting research when it's absolutely justified. The other side of this, if we open it up to a public health perspective, not one focus on the individual, concerns, and under the title of solidarity, concerns not only the responsibility and duties of subjects to participate, but also the duties of the system, of the state, of the industry, in returning benefits to society in a way that perhaps was much more privatized. So if we're moving from private rights, both of the industry and of individual patients, to a more public health-oriented understanding, this goes both ways, and the responsibility, I think, should go in both directions. And what Professor Friedman noted, incidental findings would be one example on the individual level of benefiting subjects from the research. But obviously, we all have in mind much broader benefits for the general public, and how to regulate that, sort of not to leave that only to the dynamics of the markets and rights of the industry, but also in terms of the duties and responsibilities and solidarity of governments and industries, I think is also part of the question. Let me now open it up. I'm happy to see that there are many people who want to jump in. Efrat, please. And if you could also introduce yourself. So it's a big room, but let's think of this as a small seminar in terms of the interactions.
So first, thank you to Sivan and to the panel for a great discussion. I'm Efrat Levi-Lahad. I'm a geneticist. I used to be co-chair, of Israel's National Council for Bioethics. But perhaps interestingly for this audience, in the past 2 years, the government has not thought that it needs a bioethic council, and they've not appointed a new one. But I want to ask a question of jurisdiction. Who is the regulation aimed at? And in Israel, at least, the processes that Sivan mentioned are in fact largely meant only for physicians. If I am for non-interventional research, if I'm not giving drugs or if I'm not performing surgery, if I'm a genetic, if I were me, but sitting in a university, I'm a geneticist, if I were me and I were sitting at a university and not in a hospital, I wouldn't even need to go through an IRB. I would go through a local university ethics committee, which generally has very different standards from the IRB, and a lot of these regulations wouldn't matter to me. I'll give another example. In Israel, the IRBs and what's called the National Helsinki Committee are part of the Ministry of Health. During COVID, the Ministry of Health exempted itself from IRB review. So I'm asking, who is this for? And I want to connect to what Vardit was saying about commercial companies. I think what's really new is who is doing medical research. Traditionally, medical research was being done by physicians in context of trying drugs, trying new technologies. Now that we're actually talking much more about data research, artificial intelligence, the stakeholders are very different, and it's much more commercially driven, not necessarily medical at all. And the question is, I will go back, who is the regulation for, and how do we as societies ensure that regulation is not just harmonized between countries, as you were talking about. I would first like to see it harmonized within countries, within different people, doing the same types of research.
I can answer some of that. You're absolutely right. The universities, PhD individuals are not connected to medical centers in Israel. It's a lacuna. It has not been addressed so far, and on my to-do list, it's still on. I think it should be corrected. I think it should be harmonized, and the standards that are required from PhDs or MDs who work solely at the universities should be harmonized across the board, and one rule should be fit all, even those that are not affiliated with the hospitals. That's one issue. On the issue of the pandemic, initially during the pandemic, there was a letter that came out of the Ministry of Health at the time that there was no ethics committee in the Ministry of Health that exempted the people within the Ministry of Health from obtaining an ethical approval. Once the committee under my command has been established, this practice has been stopped. So there is no. During the pandemic, research that was defined by discussion as essential for containment of the epidemic got a fast track and an approval, and sometimes exempt from obtaining an informed consent. But it was discussed internally. The hiatus was for a few months where there was no ethics committee, because the High Ethics Committee of the Ministry of Health also serves as an institutional review board from research proposals coming from the Ministry of Health.
The question wasn't that specific, but I think more generally, especially with commercial companies, how does the panel view, who is the regulation for?
Yeah.
Everyone.
The simple answer.
The simple answer is everyone, thank you for bringing this up, because I think within countries, maybe it's less obvious that we have issues, but they're very prominent. So to give you an example, the NIH just funded, I'm a part of a big team that's going to look at voice recordings as a biomarker, as a way to diagnose disease. And think about who currently sits on the big data sets of voice. It's Google. It's definitely commercial companies who have been collecting voice as an identifier. And now, because we're late to the game as a biomedical community, we have to join forces with them. But they respond to different standards. So in a way, the growing area of collaboration between traditional biomedical, institutional, university-based, healthcare system-based research and the private sector, because we're collaborating more, we're pushing them towards our level of regulation. Because you want to work with NIH money, you have to abide by the common rule. So these collaborations are actually good for protections and for expanding regulation. But I think this is one place where your skeleton or the framework needs to become internally more harmonized, because in every country, when you go to pharma, we're going to talk this evening about what pharma owes society, there's much less protections when you go into the private sector-based research. And this is an urgent matter. Each country will solve it in its own way, but I think the growing collaboration that we see between public funding and private funding is a good phenomenon.
I think that it's a very good question, and I would say that the regulation, first of all, in the AI industry, there is a growing trend of self-regulation, where commercial companies are binding themselves to AI ethics principles, whether developed in-house or others which have been published by other international bodies. So these sort of keep a very general framework to which those companies should adhere to when developing their products. As for the regulation of clinical or medical device research or health data research in those areas, I think that, again, I go back to the question of the required competencies by the regulators or by those which are served in those on those committees, so that they have the proper competency or the required speciality in order to professionally review those applications and take into consideration all the aspects that may pose harm to society as a consequence of those developments.
Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Chagai Levin. I'm a professor of epidemiology at the Hebrew University Hadassah School of Public Health, and I also chair the Hadassah IRB Committee for Data Research. And I want to continue this compelling discussion. We start our discussion by saying that, as Vardit hinted, that not doing research is not ethical. We have to do research in order to promote public health and science. What we got into, to continue a Efrat question, is a paradoxal situation where when the initiator of the study is for public health, is from the public sphere, it got maybe at least the same or even tougher regulation than when studies are done by private companies. It should be, in my opinion, exactly the opposite. We should, and the question to the panel is, should there be differences in regulation whether or not who is the initiator and the funder of the study? If the study is from public sphere with public health orientation, or the study is initiated by a private company, which is for-profit company, and the objective of the study in the end is to earn money. Should that determine how we regulate the study? Should we regulate it differently? And to continue on what you said about the solidarity, as you go to a medical center, you know that you may be examined by students, etc. So maybe we should have this kind of opt-in, opt-out different perspective, that when you are in an HMO, for example, and your data may be served for research for the benefit of public health by public health organization, with, unless you said you don't want to, it would be used. Currently in Israel, the data does not really belong to the public. It is sold by the HMO to private companies. They have access to the data because they have money, while public health professionals don't have access to the data in order to make decisions for the benefit of public health in Israel. So the current regulation does not distinguish between the needs and the real purpose of the study. So do you think it should be different regulation based on the initiator of the study?
Thank you so much for this question. I think, and it's a great question, I'd love to hear what they think, but maybe we collect more just behind you.
The other way. Simple.
Okay, my name is Søren Holm. I'm from the University of Manchester. First of all, I don't think that there's anything bioethics agree upon, apart from bioethics being important. Okay. Then I think, in the discussion, I think there's a danger of running two things together. And that is, a lot of the papers that were sort of very briefly referenced is about the research ethics process. It's about people doing completely run-of-the-mill, ordinary research and finding the process enormously difficult to navigate and hugely time-consuming. And I think that there are few people who would disagree that we should streamline our processes, and a lot of research ethics systems have been trying to do that, some with more success than others. And then there's, I think, a very different question about new things. How should the system respond when either a new research method suddenly becomes possible, like using very large data sets, or the kinds of things that Vardit talked about. And I think that is a different question. So we have lots of new things coming, and one of our problems is that these new things does not fit sort of the paradigmatic clinical research that the Helsinki Declaration was initially conceived sort of to regulate, and that a lot of our other research ethics after that, the systems we set up, are basically to, as already been stated, to regulate research which is a healthcare professional and a patient. And there are lots of new kinds of research which are not that, and which we have to find ways to regulate.
So basically two questions, one about public versus private and whether there's a sense of making a difference, and another between the regular, the routine, and the new, and how to deal with that.
So I think I'll take the first question, and the second one sounds very much... You know all about consent processes. So the first distinction is between the real world and the ideal world. Bioethicists love living in the ideal world and talk about what ought to be. So obviously, in most countries in the real world, there are significant differences between the requirements and the governance of private and public. And what I would say about an ideal world, from my perspective, is that I think when it comes to the protectionist sphere, it should be the same. So when it comes to consent, privacy protection, right to withdraw, anything to do with the interests of the participants, it should be harmonized, because to the participant, it doesn't matter who initiated the research or funded it, they deserve the same protections and their interests are equal. Where I think we can allow as a society a difference is in what research we pursue. I think the public agenda needs to align with public values. We need to have bodies, national bodies, thinking and considering where to invest, what to fund. There's an opportunity cost there as well. If you study one condition, you abandon other groups of patients. And their societal values should play a role in deciding how to invest, what to promote, where to facilitate and remove barriers because it's a public health emergency, etc. The public's, unless, if we believe that capitalism deserves to to exist, I mean, that's a different level of conversation. But in societies that allow a private sector to exist and thrive, companies will decide on their priorities. I mean, look at the money invested into Viagra research versus a malaria vaccine. Is that, ethically justified? Maybe, we can argue about that, but the decision was about profit. It wasn't about global health interests and their urgency. So I think my distinction is between protecting individuals should be the same, setting the research agenda can be different.
I just want to rehash that. The standards in the interface between the researchers, whether they're funded by the industry or the government or any other body, in their interaction between the researcher or the researchers and the individuals being researched should be exactly the same, regardless of who funds it. In terms of prioritizing, this is not a bioethical decision. This is a scientific decision. This is within the interest of the company, of the country. If a country elects to fund only research on Viagra, another country elects only to fund research on malaria, they're entitled to doing that. This is within their frame. But the standards of operation, the standards of care, the patient's anonymity, the patient's the transparency, the ability of the patient to say no, to opt in or to opt out, that should be exactly the same regardless of who the funder is. This is my view. One way of tackling the fact that the HMOs in Israel hold guard of their data and would not let researchers use it but sell it out to the highest bidder is actually creating a biobank where the participant, be it 1 million or 4 million, have a say, and they can opt out from being included in not only biobank but actually a phenobank and the electronic health record, and that should be spelled out from the start. When you join in this HMO, these are you can elect to opt in or elect to opt out. This is not being transparent right now, and I agree with you. That should be transparent and within the ability of each and every individual to join in or to join out. Now, as far as bioethics, I agree. Nothing is simple, nothing is agreed. But there are guidelines that are totally agreed upon for many, many decades. And that should be the skeleton. To that skeleton, we need to add, or guidelines, or you know, a roof and walls, not the interior design. We should add the flexibility format. The flexibility meaning that any new advances, and advances are exponentially being accumulated as we go along, unlike past research where it took many years. Now we're talking about months or a couple of years. It should be flexible, it should be included, and with each and every advancement, we should be flexible to achieve one goal, to have better healthcare on a population level, on an individual level, and maintaining the patient's anonymity and itself identity without it being leaked. This should be the guideline. This should be the guidepost of every decision that we make, and we need to be flexible enough in our doings and in our guidelines.
I'm not sure that it's feasible to have different regulatory approval pathways for public health research, or one which is conducted by perhaps academia or public health authorities, and commercial research conducted by private sponsors. Mainly because of the problem of sometimes telling those two apart, because you have many research which are hybrid initiatives. You have it's a public health issue or target, and it's conducted with the sponsorship of a commercial body, and therefore it's very hard to assign them to separate regulatory pathways or approval routes. So I think that although having some disadvantages, clear disadvantages, to the detriment perhaps of researchers from academia and public health bodies, I think that the regulatory approval pathway should remain the same one, a unified one for both kinds of research.
Let's collect a few more questions. Ari? Oh. Yeah, Lindy.
I'm wondering if it's possible that we're only looking at kind of half of the picture. And when it comes to regulation, there's two purposes. One is to protect the research subjects themselves, and one is to protect the public at large at the point of application, so that only things that we think work end up at the point of application in clinical practice. And we're only looking at biomedical research regulation generally because regulation flows to the points where it's easiest to apply. So it flows upstream where there's already choke points in the research process, and we can put in regulations there. But our goals are really to protect the public. So therefore, all this, let's say we have a certain quantity of regulation, it tends to flow to the research points. when it comes to the point of application afterwards, after things have been approved, we have very little in the way of follow-up and consistent reporting of adverse events and monitoring of even social effects and things like that. And when we're talking about the public trust and what we're trying to accomplish, really much of that needs to happen at the point of application downstream, but we're limited to our perspective on upstream regulation, and therefore we're overburdening the research process, but we're under utilizing and under allocating resources towards the further downstream monitoring and continual regulation at the point of application. So when Vardit's talking about why is there so much regulation on genetic research, it's because they're trying to protect downstream effects on the public, not necessarily the specific research subjects themselves. And that's why they're kind of overburdening at the research end, because they're afraid of the effects downstream.
Thank you, Ari. Ari, do you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry, Ari Schick. I do research broadly on ethics and emerging technologies.
And now can you take the mic down to David, and in the meantime...
Hello. Okay. I hope my question...
And you are?
My name is Maya. I work actually in a software company, but I finished my PhD philosophy of science 2 years ago. I hope this question is actually in the scope of your discussion, and I will try to be clear. So, thinking about us, we as a potential patients eventually that might be under those treatments or in the future, I wonder about this new era that so much data is being produced, and I will go back to what Eitan was saying, Professor Friedman, about incidental finding. Are we not actually in an era that maybe too much information is actually coming back to us as the public, and whether incidental findings should be reported? And we already know that about when women get pregnant in Israel, how much information she received, but not necessary information that she can actually do something about. So in terms of bioethic and all this big data, not in terms of privacy, but actually how it meets back the public, while we are allowing all research to be done, and more information keeps going back to the world and back to the patient. So what our role, and if it's our role as bioethics to discuss this.
We'll take one more, and I'll remind you of the question if need be. David.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. My name is David Haid. I'm a professor of philosophy at the Hebrew University, emeritus. I just wanted to say a few words in support of Shai Lavi's wonder about internationalization and versus localization of guidelines. I don't believe that there's any option of harmonization of guidelines, maybe a kind of skeleton, as Professor Friedman speaks about, but that's just a natural outcome of the considerations of every local regulatory committee or whatever in any country. But I think that there's no, unlike Shai, I don't think there's any tension between the sovereignty, I would call it, of every country to decide its own decisions about deep moral questions which have to do with fundamental values. So between that and individual tourism, I don't see any real tension, at least from a liberal point of view. And in that respect, Vardit, it's not a matter of relativism versus some kind of objectivism, because I think there's no contradiction between saying that whether active euthanasia should be permitted or not is an objective matter, and what it entails regarding that sovereignty. So I believe that I'm an objectivist. I think it's either right and wrong, but then I don't think that it has any implication for the freedom of individuals to travel around. And in that respect, I think that Shai is completely right. There's nothing new in genetic editing research or big data research in relation to surrogacy or active euthanasia. Active euthanasia is completely illegal, prohibited in Israel, but it's publicly known and discussed that individuals travel to Zurich to have active euthanasia, and no one tries to put any obstacles to it. Finally, one place where I would draw the line is institutions, so especially public institutions, which are in a way directly or indirectly supported by the government, like hospitals or universities. They should be careful in not violating the law by cooperating with certain practices which are considered illegal or against the regulations of the local country. So in that respect, I think the moral map is quite clear, unless I learn otherwise. Thank you.
So time is running short. We'll take one more question or comment and then open it up to the panel to conclude.
Okay, hi, Jonathan Kimmelman, McGill University. So I want to sort of maybe ask a provocative question. From the presentations and the panel discussion, there's kind of a model that, at least I'm understanding, in how regulation is understood in relation to the sciences, which is that you've got the scientific enterprise that's a sort of quasi-autonomous entity, and then you've got this sort of discrete sphere of oversight that's coming from government or other entities and whatnot, and it's kind of sitting on top of or overlaying the scientific enterprise and somehow sort of constraining or what it's doing. And I'm wondering if that kind of way of understanding these two realms as kind of discrete and autonomous entities that collide or interact in some way is in some ways missing some of the most essential or important aspects about regulation, that in some ways we can understand regulation as constitutive to the scientific process. Let me give you sort of two examples that might sort of illustrate this. Number one, lots of scientific entities regulate themselves. They either regulate themselves softly by issuing standards or guidelines, ISSCR guidelines on stem cell research, ASCO guidelines on biopsies and whatnot, or they regulate themselves in soft ways, peer review, standards for what constitutes good research, methodologies that are kind of paradigmatic for the field and whatnot. And in that way, although it's not via legislation, certainly it shapes and constrains, what actors in the field do, both in purely methodological sense, but also in a normative sense. The other sort of illustration of this idea is that it seems to me that even in cases where you have oversight coming from what seems like an external entity, there are all sorts of ways in which the science itself is shaped or constituted by that oversight. Here I'll just give two examples. iPS cells in stem cell research. Probably the development of iPS was greatly accelerated, a very important scientific advance, by the fact that there was so much sensitivity attached to human embryo research and derivation. Another example is in the realm of drug trials and clinical trials. Probably the fact that we do such rigorous randomized controlled trials, that whole sort of science of trialology or trial methodology, clinical epidemiology, is itself an artifact of the fact that we heavily regulate drug development. And so in that way, the very science that we do is different. It's shaped. The regulation is in a sense constitutive of the science that we're doing. And if that's the way we understand it, I sort of want to come back in a way to Sivan's point that are we really asking the right question about whether science is over-regulated or under-regulated? It's regulated in all sorts of different ways, and the science that's coming out is going to be heavily shaped by the various forms of regulation, both from the external as well as from the internal.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we had 4 questions, one about where regulation takes place, upstream, downstream, on the research level or its application by Ari. Then Maya was asking about too much information and not too little information in the context of incidental findings. David brought us back to the question of harmonization and whether that was at all possible or even desired. And now Jonathan's question about this misleading division between realms of science and external oversight. So don't feel like you need to answer all these questions. Choose the one that you like best. and
I'll
go
start.
for it.
I'll start. Maya, there is nobody forces anyone to get the results. They can opt out and say, you can click. I don't want to hear anything, that's fine. I think as a physician and a researcher, if I know something that's within what is defined by the ACMG as actionable, it's my duty to protect the patient, to extend his lifestyle, to prevent disease from occurring and not treat the disease after it has occurred. It's my duty to disclose to the patient once he has expressed an interest in getting it. Too much information, it's in the eye of the beholder. When I just want to give an example, in 1995, when we established the oncogenetics unit at the Biomedical Center, I remember hearing from a lot of people, too much information, women will kill themselves, women will be, deep into anxiety and depression. None of that ever happened. So the concern is real. Are we giving the patients too much information? I don't think we are. The patients elect to receive it or not to receive it, and we don't do genetic testing for Alzheimer's disease because it's not actionable. We only provide disclosed information for actionable genes, and they keep accumulating. And I think this is the right of the patient, and if he/she elects not to get it, that's fine with me. The world is full of information, and we can look at our cell phones, on TV the entire time, but we need to live in the meantime. And it's for us, as independent individuals and as sovereign individuals, we can live our lives, look around, read, or spend it on Facebook or Meta, as they call themselves right now. Okay? To answer your question, there is no wrong in dreaming. There is no wrong in trying to harmonize. It's not enforceable. It would provide countries where the regulation is backwards. In countries like in Africa, in countries like where this issue of ethics is not at the forefront, it would give them a framework. They can elect or elect not to include it in their framework, and it's not an imposing. It just gives you a framework. It does not mean to say to each country, you cannot have more than 2 children, or 1 kid in China up to a few years ago. This is a framework that would set the bar, the lowest bar possible, in order to keep the patients and their sovereignty. And this is my opinion. No harm in dreaming, even at my advanced age.
I'd like to do something weird and answer Maya and Jonathan together in one go, even though your questions seem completely distinct, and disagree with you at the same time, which is a big win. I think it is myopic, and I'm using a strong word, to look at the individual level at these issues, whether it's the information that the patient is receiving or the study that is being approved. I think that a deep understanding of the bioethical issues here requires that we acknowledge. What we do with that acknowledgement, I don't know. Acknowledge that all this happens within social structures, under cultural forces, responding to social norms. We use the word religion. We're in Israel. This shapes a lot of the social discourse. Social expectations and framings. Everything is framed by these social forces. So I think it's not almost dishonest to say a pregnant woman gets to choose and click. A pregnant woman is under tremendous pressure to know more. She is seen by society as an irresponsible mother for rejecting genetic testing of her fetus before she's even a mother. The more biotech companies offer her information, the more she's under pressure to know even things that it's not clear how they're useful to her decision-making, making pregnancy not just medicalized, which I'm fine with, but excruciating. Some of this is true of patients, not just pregnant people. So Maya, I acknowledge your concern. I think we need to think as a society about the information that we provide, because the opt-out and the click and say no to information is not always the honest answer for individuals. They're under pressures, tremendous pressures, to know more and to use services, and opting out is sometimes almost impossible under these cultural forces. And now, at a different level, if we only look at how we approve or not a single study, we obviously miss how science happens. What we choose to study, how we frame research questions, what we allow ourselves to look at even. All that happens before we decide whether your consent form is too long and what limitations we should have because you may violate the privacy of your participants. The entire thing happens under cultural norms and social forces. So what bioethics, the question before us is bioethics in 2050. I think what we need is to acknowledge that all these things happen in societies and that whether it's an individual researcher or an individual pregnant person, we are operating under these pressures, and if we don't acknowledge them, we will not be able to move forward in a way that aligns with values and in a way that protects people where it really matters.
Thank you. And final words, Sivan.
I just have a very short response to Ari's comment. I agree with you that perhaps there is not enough monitoring upstream, and that perhaps once research has been approved, well, the rest is not being closely monitored, or that ethical review boards are no longer privy to what is going on within this research. But this is what GCP standards are for. I mean, good clinical practice standards, which pharmaceutical companies are bound by, are exactly for this part of the ethical. Once it's being approved, they have to report adverse events. They have to. So I'm not sure it's even practical to expect that the research ethics committees will be involved in research and accompany it and just monitor it as it goes along.
There's simply not enough funding for the follow-up process. But on paper, each and every application to the IRB that has been approved needs to be extended one annually. But there is no way to monitor what happens. You rely on the self-reporting of the researcher. He says everything's fine, no serious adverse effects, and there is no way to confirm that. Yeah. In theory, there is a committee that has not yet been established or financed. Until that happens, there is no way to monitor it.
Right, and that goes also to questions of enforcement, right? Even on the research regulation level, in the Israeli context, we know that there's very little possibilities of enforcing either the regulation itself or its outcomes. So this is, I think, a very powerful and interesting, provocative panel. I want to thank especially Sivan, first of all, for writing this review and presenting this to us. Thank you, Sivan, and thank you also, of course, to Eitan and to Vardit, to Professor Ravitsky, Professor Friedman, and Dr. Tamir, and to you, wonderful participants and audience, for asking these questions. There will be much more conversations after the break. So thank you.